everybody. Welcome back to the Moonlit Library, your home for all things smutty story time. I am so excited to be back. We are back and maybe not better than ever, but we are definitely than ever. It's been a couple of weeks, y'all. And so I am really, really, really happy to be back reading smut to the world at large. And by world at large, I mean like the tens of people who join me every week for this whole smut experience. Thank you, you guys, for coming back. And for anybody new, so excited to have you. I really hope that you love this week's read and that you go visit some of our past reads because all of these authors that you're hearing now are ones that I really, really believe in. They are indie authors who captured my heart and have now become auto read authors for me. So I'm really hoping that you guys dig this indie author that I stumbled onto with zero, zero foresight. There was no prediction here, except for maybe Instagram's algorithm. I guess it would be Instagram's algorithm that took me here. But this was Kismet. Let's just say that. I saw, as you all know, I love me an Instagram ad that has the sort of her father's best friend, like overlaid across a picture. I saw an Instagram ad for this particular author, and it was for her novella, recently published. And I was psyched because the novella was posed as an age gap idea. And really just, that's all you gotta say to me. Age gap, I am here for it. And so I started reading this novella, skipping in line all the rest of my TBR, because that's how I fucking roll. And within, like, 5 pages, I realized I loved this author. Her writing style is completely different than anybody else's I've ever found. And she manages to just absorb you into the story so beautifully. And while we are coming back off a hiatus, and y'all saw we broke out the dark romance at our last read, we're going to continue the trend. Because this week's is also dark romance. A little bit different, but also dark romance. And definitely a forced proximity type of thing. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to this week's Smutty Storytime author, which is Stevie Sparks, and this week's book, which is Heart of Stone. So now we are going to go ahead and break into our synopsis and our content warnings. And then we are going to dig into the first 3 chapters of Heart of Stone, which, for anybody wondering, it is subtitled as a steamy, dark billionaire romance. Who doesn't love a steamy, dark billionaire romance? I know I do. Warren was the boy Kate always had a crush on as a girl, her brother's best friend, and his murderer. A decade after Warren was imprisoned, Kate's life hasn't quite turned out how she'd have liked. She works for her father's seedy nightclub turned casino, trying to outrun her suicidal thoughts, knowing that eventually she'll run out of breath. But when her father loses the business, and their house with it, Kate's breathing finally begins to stutter. Kate was the little sister Warren had always wanted, and the daughter of the man who framed him. Finally free, Warren's only goal is to enact revenge on the man responsible for ruining his life. A twist of fate made him a billionaire, but ruthless tenacity will ensure he gets what he wants. Except he finds Kate where he left her all those years ago, and suddenly his feelings for her aren't so sisterly after all. We love us here at the Moonlit Library. A good, like, taboo type trope. And older brother's best friend, and murderer, no less, is the absolute forbidden trope. It's fantastic. And so we've got this childhood friends to lovers vibe. We've got this unrequited childhood love vibe. We've got just touch her and die vibes. Like this book brings all the tropes. Real talk. It's so enjoyable. So now that we've done the synopsis, we're going to break into the content warning because, as you can tell just by our synopsis, there are content triggers that we have to pay attention to in this particular book. Trigger warnings. This is a dark romance, so there are triggers scattered throughout. False imprisonment, being framed for a crime. Abortion, pregnancy, knife play, spanking, drug addiction, gambling addiction, car accidents, loss of limbs, torture, poverty, revenge porn, physical violence, depression, suicidal thoughts, suicidal actions, murder, rape, human trafficking, CSA, prison, foul language, and of course, explicit sex. That does cover a lot of ground. And this does deal with really dark topics. So please be aware of your triggers. And if, for some reason, you are not able to proceed, either with our read or if you pick it up, the read in general, please keep yourself top of mind and make sure you stay safe. So we are going to dig into chapters 1 through 3 now. And I'm going to apologize in advance because Stevie is in fact British. And as we all know, I am not. So I am not going to break out the British accent that 10-year-old me perfected because she was a nerd. We're just going to keep plugging along with the standard US accent. So, without further ado, let's crack into it. Chapter 1. Kate. Dad, Kate whispered, horrified. The misery budded in her heart, threatened to bloom. I don't understand. You've lost your club? He took her hand, perhaps to stop the shaking in his own. The acrid notes of cheap alcohol and cigarette smoke hung heavy on his breath, as they always did when he returned from his club. Charlton's Gentlemen's Club. Club. A word fragranced with memories of aristocratic gentlemen's establishments in St. James, where the nobility would hide from nagging wives and share a tipple over the newest copy of the Times. Her dad's business was little more than a seedy casino-turned-strip club where only the most desperate would be found on any given day, or the most dangerous. Dad's eyes remained glued to their intertwined hands, as though he were too afraid to look her in the eye. I made a bet, he admitted. Kate's shoulders sunk in horror. She wrenched her hand from his. You promised you wouldn't gamble again. You promised! I know, he nodded, letting loose a cider-infused sigh. I'm sorry, but you should have seen. Her anger exploded from her in a fierce strike as his excuses began. She'd heard them all before. I've spent all evening on the phone to the debt management people. She picked up the enormous stack of invoices she'd had to compile, brandishing them in his direction. Do you know how long it took to sort out? I had to detail every single asset. Her airway was almost cut off by the realization. The house. The house that Dad had bought under the name of the club as a way of finagling his way out of paying tax, as suggested by his dodgy accountant. Dad, please tell me you didn't. Her father, who she'd always accepted regardless of his many faults, couldn't even meet her gaze. He glared at his hands like a naughty schoolboy sitting outside his head teacher's office waiting for a bollocking. I'm sorry, Katie. Don't Katie me, she hissed, storming to her feet. I have spent the last decade of my life trying to get the club back on its feet financially, working day and night to solve every single mess you've made, consolidating loans and pleading with companies to help you get back on your feet. All while her friends from school had been moving on with their lives, marrying and multiplying without a care in the world. Not that they kept in touch with her anymore, given that she spent her every waking hour attempting to manage Dad's finances and doing admin for the club. The only contact she had with any of them was social media, seeing their perfect lives plastered across her shattered phone screen. Kate shook her head, holding her arms across her chest. What am I doing with my life? Living in a one-bedroom terrace house with her father. The only sacrifice he'd ever made for her was to give her the bedroom and sleep on a futon in the living room. The pale green carpet beneath her feet was threadbare, whilst her father's smoking had long since stained the walls a sickening yellow. "I can't do this anymore." Her voice was soft. "I can't do anything anymore." At that, he looked up. "Finally. What does that mean?" "It means I can't sit here and watch you throw your life away, in addition to the club and this fucking house, apparently." She gestured to the photo on the coffee table next to the futon, the only photograph Dad would allow in the house. "Ever since Aaron died, you've been destroying yourself, Dad." Her voice cracked. "And in the process, you're destroying me." "Do you not think I've had enough to put up with?" he responded, his backbone suddenly appearing at the barest hint of criticism. "You were supposed to be the adult. No one forced you to get into that car." The disappointment in her expression said the rest. "No one forced you to let a drunken teenager drive your car." It had been the morning of Erin's 18th birthday when she'd been woken by a kindly social worker, telling her that her father, brother, and brother's best friend had been in a car accident, and that her brother hadn't survived. She'd been taken into care for the 2 months that her father was in the hospital, having had no one else to care for her. "There's still no one to care for me." The world fell away beneath her feet at the realization that she was totally and utterly alone in the world. Dad had used her as nothing more than a workhorse to keep his business afloat, gambling away years of her work whenever the need struck him, whilst his drug addiction took care of the rest. "Don't you dare!" Dad hissed, pointing a yellow-nailed finger at her. His face had turned an alarming shade of pink, as it always did when he drank too much. They never spoke of Aaron's death, nor the circumstances surrounding it, or more specifically, the fault surrounding it. Kate blinked slowly, her anger deflating like a popped balloon. Dad was failing her just as much as he failed Aaron, just at a tenth of the speed. "I'm going to bed," she announced colorlessly, heading towards the narrow set of spiral stairs in the corner. Her father nodded, flicking on the TV and finding a boxing match to watch. "I think that would be best. Perhaps things will look better in the morning. We have a few days before the club and its assets change hands. We'll sort something out." Tears burnt the back of her eyes, but she managed to conjure a final smile at him as she ascended the stairs. "No, we won't." The layout of the upstairs of the house was a perfect match to the downstairs, with the kitchen being downstairs and the bathroom up. The yellowing walls pervaded here too, her father's cigarette smoke drifting up through the stairs. Kate glared at it as it invaded her space. But she wouldn't give to have a door. Instead, the curved staircase came right through the floor of her bedroom, crashing through any privacy she might have wanted. Silently, she packed her things into an old weekend bag she'd bought at a charity shop. The musty scent of disuse wrinkled her nose. The fake leather was peeling off in flaky chunks, but it would have to do. Tears attempted to escape down her cheeks when she found the single item she kept in the bag, but Kate furiously swatted them away. She ran her thumb over the little heart-shaped locket, the only thing she had left of her mother. She clipped it on, hiding it underneath her collar with a clenched jaw. Dad didn't deserve it. Not after everything he put her through. A commotion outside pricked her ears. Dogs barking. Her neighbor's staffies, she guessed. Kate poked her head out of the window. Her neighbor, Peter, worked the night shift down at a local hotel. To stop his dogs destroying his house, Peter usually left them in his garden whilst he worked, but they were making quick work of his lackluster fencing. They'd escaped last week. Again. She exhaled a sigh of relief when she saw they were still in the garden. In fact, judging from the plumes of weed smoke rising from beneath the front door's awning, Peter himself was home. Good. The last thing she needed tonight was to be a dog wrangler. When the few belongings she had were packed, Kate sat on her bedroom floor. The metal railings of her bed frame pressed uncomfortably into her spine, but she remained where she was. The cold reality of her situation hit home when there was nothing left to do. no physical task to take her mind off things. Kate scrolled through the job listings with a growing heaviness in her chest. Not to mention the price of studio flats. Even the smallest, graudiest of flats neared $1,000 a month. $1,000 a month to live in a flat so small she could touch the kitchen sink whilst lying in bed. Her father's business was largely illegal. True, the strip club and casino elements were legal, but the prostitution was not. The drugs changing hands were not. What would her CV even say? Kate Charlton. Employment history. After working at Charlton's Gentlemen's Club since leaving school 4 years ago, my attempts to save my father from his many vices have finally failed. Consequently, I'm looking for a new challenge. Experienced in balancing, probably dodgy books, general administration, payroll, social media, organizing illegal fights, completing tax returns, communicating with bailiffs, and not voicing my many concerns about the way the business is handled. Uncomfortable around people in general, but skilled in Microsoft Excel and catching badly trained dogs. Still annoyed about the last season of Game of Thrones. She let her head fall back against the foot of the bed and closed her eyes. At the same time, a heavy thump rocked the front door. Kate heard her father moving slowly towards the porch and scowled. Had he phoned his dealer? Like he usually does whenever something goes wrong. It was what he'd done after Aaron had died. Spend money they didn't have on a habit he couldn't fucking afford. Even when he said he had nothing, what he meant was nothing for you. A decade after Aaron's death, his title as the favorite child still stung. The favorite of two. It would have been easier to handle if she had other siblings to commiserate with, but to play favorites with two children? All it did was separate them. Kate had never had a brother. She had had a competitor, a challenger for her father's love and affection. The title of favorite still reigned even now. Aaron was barely cold before his sanctification began. Kate loved her brother deep down, but she hated who her father made him out to be. Aaron had grown up in Dad's club and had fallen in with a bad crowd at an early age. He'd not been long out of Borstal at the time of his death, sentenced for theft. She sighed as she heard her father unlock the deadbolts she'd inexpertly drilled into the front door. The photograph of Aaron on the coffee table was a far better child than she would ever be, at least in her father's eyes. Talbot! Dad's voice drifted upstairs. The sound put Kate on edge, the false cheeriness laced within. You all right? Where Kate had been expecting Talbot to make a reply, the only response was the quivering bang as the front door bounced off the wall behind it, closing shortly after. It was only then that Talbot deigned to make a reply, whoever he was. Paul, Talbot said curtly. Gents! Dad laughed gratingly over the sound of movement. Heavy bangs reverberated through the floorboards. How many of them were there? Gents, he said again, sounding slightly more strangled. Kate knew her father too well not to recognize desperation when she heard it. Perhaps I can be of assistance. You're right, a second voice said. A deep, heavy growl that sounded as if it belonged to a bear of a man. Sign this. Paper rustled. No. I have a week before the company needs to be signed over. It's barely been 2 hours. Tell your employer that I need time. The sick crunch of a fist crashing into flesh made her jump, closely followed by her father's pained grunt and shattering glass. I'll take no orders from you, the bear replied. Kate gasped as the stairs began to rattle, the telltale sign that someone was climbing them. There was nowhere to hide, not even a cupboard. A bald head came into view as she scrambled to her feet, closely followed by a pair of angry, glaring eyes. There's a woman up here, the bear told the others, raising his growly voice as the odd noises and bangs continued downstairs. A hairless bear, then. He took the last few steps, towering above her. Is this your latest tart? He inspected her from head to toe in a long, lingering look that made her skin crawl. I thought your deal with Graves would have scratched this particular itch for you. Kate held her hands up, flinching as something shattered downstairs. I don't want any trouble. The bear snatched her unlocked phone out of her hands. "I'll be having this." He grabbed her arm in a punishing grip and began to yank her back towards the stairs. "Get down." An enormous hand landed in the middle of her back, propelling her down the first few steps until she came crashing into the metal railings. They dug deep into her ribs, but she kept her complaints silent. I'm going. Devastation met her eyes as she reached the ground floor. The television was smashed. Her neat pile of paper for the debt management people had been scattered on the ground. The curtains had been ripped from their poles. A man was even tearing the couch cushions to shreds, turfing white fluff onto the threadbare carpet. She jumped. Another man was sweeping their porcelain tableware onto the floor. Dinner plates and cereal bowls hit the ground, exploding into razor-sharp shards. Kate yelped when the bear grabbed her by the hair, brandishing her like a weapon in front of her father. "Talk!" he hissed, whilst Kate scrambled to hang on to him, attempting to minimize the pain. Dad's eyes were on the man destroying the couch cushions. Blood dripped from his nose. "Please. There's no need for this. Just tell me what you're looking for." The red-headed man, now emptying out their cutlery drawer, answered. "Ah," he said, Talbot's voice. He sauntered towards Kate. "I'm impressed, Paul. Or are you paying her?" Too close. He was too close. Kate attempted to move backwards, but the bear held her firm by the hair. Talbot's hands trailed up to the curve in her hips, and he nodded appreciatively, even as Kate attempted to wiggle away. "Fuck you," she hissed, trying to kick at him. Talbot's sneer creased his nose. "Do you not like it when the shoe is on the other foot?" Dad said nothing, refusing to meet her eyes. "Like always. What are you looking for?" "What makes you think we're looking for anything?" the bear said from behind her, his hand still knotted in her hair. "Is that what your employer wants, whoever he is?" Dad spread his arms wide. "Has he not taken everything already? Even the house is his now." Talbot glared at her father, his eyes narrowed. "And whose fault is that?" he said softly. He bent to pick up the photograph of Aaron that her father had been standing in front of. "No!" Dad attempted to snatch it back in a ferocious swipe, but Talbot shoved him away. Thrown off balance, Dad tripped over the poof, landing on his arse in an untidy heap. "This is your boy, isn't it?" Talbot's lips twisted in disgust. He stared down at her father with nothing less than utter revulsion. His whole life ahead of him, too. "Aaron, wasn't it?" "Aaron," Dad confirmed, his grief as sharply illustrated as it had been a decade ago. "Well," Talbot made himself comfortable on the leather poof. "We have a few questions for you, Charlton. And my friend here," he pointed to the bear still holding Kate in his grasp, "is going to take her somewhere safe. In the meantime, you and I are going to have a little chat." Kate spoke up, just about managing to hide the fear slinking its way into her veins. "And what exactly are you going to do with me?" A cruel smile lit Talbot's face. "That's entirely up to Charlton here," he nodded towards her father. "But know this, if he fails to comply with our instructions, you'll suffer for it." He threw Aaron's photograph back onto the coffee table. The glass cracked over Aaron's smile. Kate's eyes were wide with horror. Dad got to his feet, his jaw clenching, as the third man finished ripping the couch cushions to shreds. "What are your questions?" Kate cried out in pain as Brax, the name of the bear-like, hair-pulling bastard, yanked the bag off her head, removing some of her hair in the process. For the first time in an hour, light flooded her vision. Too much light. She gave a pained squint, holding her hand up in front of her face to shield her gaze. "This is where you'll be staying," Brax rumbled. In his fist, a few strands of brown hair fell from the bag to the floor. The world's worst hairdresser. Kate scowled at him, blinking away her sensitivity to the light to take her first glance of the room. The bedroom. Her lips parted. She had expected to be squirreled away to a dirty warehouse, or even taken to her father's club to await a sharp questioning. But this bedroom was magnificent. Where her bedroom at home was a plain creation of poverty, providing only the bare essentials, this room had been designed by a master craftsman. Dark blue paneling covered the walls, contrasting against the stark white decorative covering. The ceiling hadn't been spared, with a rose medallion stretching out to all four corners of the room. At its center hung an elegant chandelier, scattering light over the king-sized bed, draped in a foliate-themed bedspread in a dangerously dark midnight blue. A matching sofa was positioned in front of the bed, upholstered in a lustrous fabric that Kate knew would be silky to the touch. She pulled in an endlessly satisfying lungful of the scent pervading the room. It was intoxicating. She wanted to bathe in its warmth. There were matching elements everywhere. The cream leather headboard matched the bedside tables, the sofa matched the bed, the cushions on the sofa matched the enormous circular rug under the bed, all reflected in an enormous mirror running along the length of the wall opposite the curtains. The curtains themselves were no less luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling windows peeked out behind the kind of sweeping drapes Kate had only seen in films. Heavy pleated fabric topped by matching cornices. The faded blue curtains she had in her bedroom looked like rags in comparison. The thought hit her like a ton of bricks. A reminder of her constant poverty. A reminder that by 22 she should have had her life in gear. Instead, she lived in her father's ratty house, filled with the cheapest of possessions and a sparsely populated fridge that was only ever visited by food from the reduced section. Here, though, even the lamps screamed money. I hate poverty. The constant feeling of it bearing down on her shoulders, whilst she desperately tried to clamber out from underneath it, compounded by her father digging deeper beneath their feet. Kate looked up to Brax, hating him and the room in equal measure, the only emotion she could bring herself to feel. How long for? Hours? Days? Until Stone decides you can leave. Brax walked to the door, dipping his head slightly to get through it. A long corridor could be seen behind his bulk, with furnishings of gold running along its length. Who is Stone? And what about my father? What's going to happen to him? Stone is my employer. Brax looked down at her with something like pity or disgust. But I would be more worried about yourself, Ms. Charlton. Why? She asked, panicking. The disgusting luxury of her bedroom had lulled her away from the tied-to-a-chair torture she had been envisaging. I haven't done anything wrong. Before he locked the door, Brax left her with a single question. Haven't you? In the silence that remained, Kate's attention swirled around the room. She sat on the bed. Or rather, she sat on the silken cloud masquerading as a bed. How can something be this soft? Money. Kate ran over to the window, desperate to find any indication of where she was being imprisoned. She almost laughed at the view in front of her. The open window let in still, warm air perfumed with the sound of crickets and summer insects. The rising moon was full and bright, casting soft, silvery rays on the garden. The garden, if she could call it that, was enormous. If she squinted, she could make out a stone path winding through the flowers and shrubs, leading to a picturesque pond. Where the fuck am I? Brax's question stayed with her, prodding at her brain. Kate locked onto the bedroom door, dreading what, or who, was behind it. Had she done something wrong? Her teeth worried at her bottom lip as she pondered the question. She had enabled her father for far too long, that was for sure. Charlton's Gentlemen's Club would have gone under years ago had it not been for her, but was that crime? She thought of all the times she'd overlooked some of the club's transactions. The stolen goods, the money laundering, the tax evasion. She pressed her lips together, but no one was being hurt by it. There was no victim there. The stolen goods were taken from massive companies whose insurance would cover everything. Kate hugged her arms around herself. What was happening to Dad at this very moment? Were those men hurting him? Were they going to hurt her? Was this entire bedroom fit for a king's situation, a way to lull her into a false sense of security? She flinched as a door somewhere in the house slammed with such force it rattled the mirror on the wall. The unknown pecked at her brain with all the delicacy of a sledgehammer. Leaping to her feet, Kate traced the perimeters of the room. Her lips parted when she entered the ensuite. The shower alone was enormous enough to need 2 shower heads and 6 downlights, something she found ridiculous. The sharp sound of the bedroom door closing behind her had Kate jumping up in fright. A man cleared his throat, a gravelly noise that put her on edge. Had Brax returned to pull the rest of her hair out? The drive here had given her plenty of time to enjoy his company, after he'd shoved a bag on her head and thrust her into what she assumed was a van. Kate inched around the corner. Relief loomed large when she saw it wasn't Brax, but... Warren? She breathed, unable to believe her eyes. He was so like the teenager she'd once trailed after like a lovesick puppy, recognizable underneath the sinister guise of a tall, scowling man. Not even his locks of jet-black hair could shadow his glittering emerald eyes. Black stubble grazed his cheeks. Where the Warren she'd known had been lanky, a wiry boy not yet having grown into a man, this Warren stood proudly. A man in his prime, with the wide shoulders, dark beard, and tattoos to match. A smile broke through her worry, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Kate crossed the room on wobbly legs to throw herself into his arms. Warren! She hit his unexpectedly solid chest, clinging to him like he was the only thing keeping her afloat in a sea of misery. I thought you were still in prison. She choked, pulling his once familiar scent into her lungs. Warren's arms remained at his side. She reared back. You're taller than the last time I saw you. Aaron's death. Her lips tightened at that. Kate had been so relieved to see a friendly face, she'd forgotten what he'd done. He'd driven whilst drunk and high and killed her brother. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes were raging infernos. Kate attempted to take a step back, but Warren grabbed her chin with a hand that dwarfed her own. His touch was rough, far from the calm, protective manner in which he'd used to care for her. Her brother's closest friend, who was more gentle than her brother had ever been. Warren, she whispered, trying to push him away. What's wrong with you? With me? His brow cocked up as a cruel glint lit his face. Kate wriggled in discomfort as his eyes traced her body, riding her curves. Just like Talbot had done, except she knew Warren. Warren had taught her how to tie her shoelaces and how to ride a bike. He had been with her through so much of her childhood, a comforting, nurturing figure she could always rely on. More than she'd ever relied on Aaron or her father. You're angry, Kate stated just as Warren forced her back against the wall. I was. His eyes shone bright with hate, an emotion he'd never before directed at her. But now I'm just disappointed in you, kitten. Kate's sharp inhale nearly choked her. Kitten. A name she hadn't heard in years. A treasured relic that had nearly been forgotten amongst her memories. You're not quite grown up to be a Kate, Warren had said not long after they'd met. The two had been at the local park next to the children's home in which Warren had grown up. It had been an early spring day, drowning in butterflies and bumblebees and laughter. I am so, Kate giggled, squealing as Warren pushed her higher and higher on the swings. She swooped, her legs flying through the air. Warren had kept a close watch on her, even from the beginning. You're not a cat, either. Kate leant back, her long plait dangling behind her. Definitely not a cat. He darted round to the front of the swings. Jump! He dared her. Warren braced as Kate leapt into his embrace without hesitation, but he caught her with ease. Giggling with joy, she wrapped her arms around Warren's neck and squeezed him tightly. Warren's face had slackened in shock at her touch, as though it was something he'd never experienced before. But then he'd hugged her in turn, holding her close with an expression of fierce joy. A boy of 10, Warren was a giant to her then. As they stood surrounded by the bright sunshine and the sounds of laughter and play, Kate had felt the connection between them growing. Even then. He'd ruffled her hair, his face alight with pride. Not a cat, but perhaps a kitten. Kate leant against him, treasuring the feeling of being cared for once in her life. A small grumble of acquiescence left her as she accepted Warren's name for her. "Come on then, kitten. We should be getting you home," Warren announced, treading the path towards Kate's house. "But first, let's get you an ice cream cone." A small giggle left her. A nickname. Kate smiled gleefully. Someone liked her enough to give her a nickname. The 18 years since then had wrought changes in them both, but Kate still reacted to her old nickname, Kitten. "What exactly have I done to disappoint you, Warren?" she asked pointedly. "Given the fact that you were imprisoned for causing Aaron's death, I think the disappointment should be the other way around." Warren loomed over her, pressing her further against the wall. His hand still held her chin in a punishing grip. A jolt shuddered through her as his thumb caressed her lips. Nothing more than a gentle whisper following their contours. His nostrils flared, his eyes fixed to her mouth. "Warren, Shh," he urged her quietly, his free hand beginning to outline the curve in her hip. Warren pushed his body against hers, his wide shoulders engulfing her completely. She squeaked as he reached the bottom of her breast. A strange sensation came over her, plunging beyond the pit of her stomach. A hot, fiery warmth that called out for more. She wriggled, opening her mouth to speak, only to have Warren roughly cover it with his hand. "What did I say?" he said carefully. Her attention was called to something pressing into her stomach, a long, thick length that seemed both eager and firm. "Oh, God." She let out a muffled squawk of alarm. He was aroused. He was very aroused. "Quiet." Warren pressed his nose into her neck, deeply inhaling. "Kitten," he growled savagely. Her breath sawed in and out of her lungs, the sound magnified by Warren's hand partially covering her nose. Was this really happening? Kate was mesmerized by his eyes, as she always had been. Their green depths seemed to sink into her very soul, laying her bare for his examination, something that he apparently seemed keen to explore. An inch from her face, Warren removed his hand. His thumb trailed behind, pulling her bottom lip downwards slightly as it left. He dipped his head. Kate could feel his breath against her face. The atmosphere between them hummed with energy and unspoken emotions. Kate tipped her chin upwards, reaching towards his lips. She was going to kiss Warren, the boy she'd always yearned for, even at the young age of 12. She closed her... Stone. Stone? The word cut through them both, severing the connection. Brax stood near the doorway, his muscular build and scowling face giving him an immediate air of harsh authority. "You're needed in the cellar." Warren nodded, his gaze never leaving Kate. He waited until Brax left before speaking. "Who would have thought you'd turn out to be as much of a scheming cunt as your father, kitten?" Kate frowned in confusion, but Warren had already pulled away. "Wait," Kate stammered, following him. "Your stone? The stone that ruined my father and kidnapped me?" The emotional turmoil heaved through her. "I thought we were friends, Warren." Even if he was partly responsible for Aaron's death, she wouldn't have thought he'd be capable of willful maliciousness towards her. He turned to her at the last moment with those burning eyes of hatred. "I thought so too, kitten." Chapter 2. Warren. Water tinged red with blood seeped into the shower drain. He'd lost his temper with Paul Charlton. Deservedly so. The first rays of dawn were splashed across the landscape as Warren stumbled out of the shower. He swiped a hand through the condensation fogging up the mirror, grumbling at the bloodshot eyes looking back at him. Attempting to blink away the grittiness, Warren dressed himself slowly. It wouldn't be the first night he'd gone without sleep. It wouldn't even be the first night he'd gone without sleep because of Paul Charlton. The nights in the hospital had been the worst. After he'd been pulled out of Paul's car in pieces and rushed to hospital in a screaming ambulance, protesting his innocence all the way. The next time he'd woken was to find his room guarded by a police officer who told him he was under arrest for causing death by careless driving, under the influence of drink or drugs. Aaron's death, no less. His best friend. The words that ruined his life. When Warren should have been focusing on the long process of grieving and trying to regain his independence, he'd instead been imprisoned. He'd spent the first year of his sentence in the prison's healthcare wing, surrounded by dying criminals and the repetitive noises of unceasing equipment. He'd been 18, still half a boy. Through the two-sided mirror, Warren watched Kate with keen eyes. She'd curled herself into a tight little ball in her sleep. He shouldn't have gone in to see her last night. That had been a mistake. The bookkeeper. She was the fucking bookkeeper. There hadn't been a whisper of Kate when Warren had been investigating Charlton's Gentlemen's Club. She was never seen there, nor was there any sign of her on the security cameras. The employees had no knowledge of her. Warren had assumed that, given the train wreck her father had turned into, Kate had simply bailed and found happiness elsewhere. He hadn't expected her to be as dirty as Paul himself. "Please, Paul, don't do this, please." Warren's pitiful voice echoed in his mind as clear as the day he'd said the words, trying to drag himself out of the crumpled car. The day he'd been released, Warren had sworn he'd never be that weak again. He stepped out into the bedroom corridor, almost running headfirst into Linda. His housekeeper was a short, rotund woman, ruling the house with an iron fist. "You need to get those seen to," Linda said with a frown, pointing at his hand. "They'll be black and blue by this evening." Warren casually glanced at his split knuckles. She was right, of course, but he shrugged. "I'll be fine." Linda shoved a hand on her hip. "Dare I ask?" It was in the cellars. Braxton was likely readying the pressure washer as they spoke. "Nothing you have to worry about." "I'd better not," she warned him. "Will that girl in your bedroom need feeding?" Kate. His nostrils flared when he thought of how he'd acted with her last night. The moment she'd pressed her body against his, clutching him tightly, he'd lost his mind. His kitten. Where was the sweet girl he'd always known? Lost somewhere in the body of a wildcat. No. After what she'd done, she could starve. Warren didn't bother knocking on the bedroom door. He wrenched it open, powering against the chair she'd wedged under the door handle in the night. The chair legs screeched against the floor, setting his teeth on edge. Kate was on her feet in an instant, standing before him in the same creased clothes she'd worn last night. "Warren," she said, her lips tightening. Not troubling himself with a greeting, he tightly clasped her wrist and dragged her from the room, ignoring his body's response to her, ignoring the urge to lock the door behind them and lick every inch of her skin. "Wait," she begged. "Please, Warren, you're hurting me." He didn't spare her a look as he wrenched her down the back stairwell, a clean white shaft that would allow them to directly descend 2 stories to the cellars. "Where are you taking me?" Her question echoed around the cavernous space. "Warren," she panted, struggling to keep up as he rounded yet another set of stairs. "I can't walk this fast." And yet, she did. Finally, he pressed his thumb to the scanner on the cellar door and hauled her inside. They met a long corridor dotted with heavy doors, each with its own fingerprint scanners. With a macabre smirk, he steered her into the room from which her father had so recently departed. A sizable pool of blood remained on the floor, congealing where it lay into a thick red soup. Red handprints could be seen around the space, as well as great red droplets scattered like seeds in the wind. "Whose blood is that?" Kate's voice was high as she stepped away from him, cradling her wrist. "Sit." He gestured to the small table and chairs in the corner. A command, not a request. Kate edged around the room, avoiding her father's blood with every step, arriving at the table with the whites of her eyes on full view around her pupil. Warren's grin was a lazy one. "Are you scared, kitten?" "Why are you doing this, Warren?" She finally pulled her focus away from the ocean of blood on the floor, curling her arms around herself as she sat. He took the seat opposite her, leaning across the table. To his left was a box file full of the same documents he'd shown to Paul. "Because I can. Because I deserve to." "Where is William Graves?" he asked her, pinning her to the chair with a heavy glare. "I don't know who that is." Her eyes widened when her gaze finally fell on his knuckles. "What happened to your hands?" He kept his face neutral. A simple thing. "What do you think happened to my hands?" "Have you killed my father?" she whispered, nothing more than a hushed exhale. Her voice rose with every word. "Is that his blood? Is he dead?" Your father is alive, he told her. Just. Relief swamped her face. For now. It disappeared just as quickly beneath the fierce knotting of her brows. What? If you answer my questions, we can keep it that way. At present, he has all his fingers and toes. Amongst other things, I'm sure he is rather attached to. If you lie to me, I will begin removing them. I will make you watch. And then I'll start on you. Do you understand? Yes, she squeaked, pale as a ghost. Good. He tilted his head to the side. William Graves. Where is he? I don't know. I don't know who that is. For fuck's sake. Paul hadn't known the man's whereabouts either. What is your precise role as part of your father's club? I'm the bookkeeper. Kate flashed a glance at the bloodied room. I pay and send out invoices. I make sure the employees' salaries are paid. I sort out the social media. I pay Dad's debts, or try to. I pay out winnings. I handle the company's ledgers. She exhaled a panicked breath. I I file the company's tax returns. Just general bookkeeping duties. Where are the company's ledgers kept? On my laptop. On the desktop. Warren nodded. That's what Paul had said too. Is it password protected? Yes, she confirmed shakily. The password is Aaron01121989 in brackets. With a capital A. Good. Paul hadn't been able to tell him that. Brax's team had gotten into it anyway, but it was nice to think she was starting off by being truthful. And where is the laptop? In the leather poof in the living room. Another truth. Warren pulled out his phone as it buzzed. He flicked through a message from Reese concerning an upcoming board meeting. That was something he could deal with later. Afterwards, he pulled the box file towards him, ready to lay out what he'd compiled. He took the first photograph out. A grainy image taken from the security cameras inside Charlton's Gentlemen's Club. The cheap, shitty cameras courtesy of Paul Charlton. Tell me about this man. Kate slid the photograph towards her, peering closely. I don't know him. He tried another, to the same result. A different man, albeit one guilty of the same crime as the first. I don't know him. I'm sorry, Warren. The third photograph was of a woman wearing nothing except a terrified expression. Black boxes had been strategically placed to conceal her modesty. She looks petrified, his kitten observed, her brows drawing together in sympathy. Is that a bruise on her cheek? You tell me, Warren replied softly. She was the one who'd handled the transaction. Or did she prefer not to see the evidence of her bookkeeping? He pulled out the next 3 photos. All nude women, all disheveled. Kate's eyes were as round as saucers. These were all taken at my father's club? He didn't answer her. They both knew the truth. Instead, he pulled out photocopies of 4 pages in the club's ledger and placed each above the photographs of the corresponding women. What was it you said? You handle the company's ledgers, and yet you've no idea who these women are. Why would the 2 things be connected? Feeling his eyebrows quirk, he began setting out the worst photographs. One after another, he laid them out, ignoring Kate's fake gasps of horror. They overlapped by the time he'd finished. Look, he commanded her, standing to grab her by the back of the neck and force her face forwards. Don't you dare look away. She turned her anguished eyes on the photographs, her lips twisting in revulsion. Why are you showing me these? Because I want you to look at what you facilitated. Do they look like consenting women to you? Kate shook her head. A choke came out of her as she recognized a familiar face. Is that my father? Yes, kitten, that's your father. He'd hidden the identities of the women, but he hadn't bothered with the men. She shoved the photograph away as if it burned her. I didn't know he... She trailed off. What, partook of the goods? Warren suggested. The goods? Was that not what you recorded them as on the ledgers? He bit out, feeling a palpable sense of satisfaction as he watched her throat moving uncomfortably, her skin a distinct shade of gray. Perhaps you'd like me to check. Kate lurched to her feet unsteadily, spraying vomit across the cold, soulless room. It splattered wetly onto the congealed blood left behind by her father. Each heave racked her body until she finally sank to her knees and wept. Warren was hit with an uncomfortable thought. During his interrogation, Paul had painted Kate as a co-conspirator, a partner in crime. She'd been there at every turn, he'd said. As his bookkeeper, Kate knew more about the business than he did. Every woman trafficked, every crime committed. What if he's trying to pin the human trafficking on Kate like he tried to pin Aaron's death on me? No one had listened to Warren when he'd protested his innocence. And Kate. What if I'm making the same mistake they did? Fuck. Warren shrugged his jacket off his shoulders and tucked it over hers. Come on, he said softly, scooping her into his arms. What are you? She twisted when he lifted her, grabbing onto his neck as though she expected him to launch her into the puddle of gruel in the middle of the room. No, no, no. Shh. It's okay. I've got you. Her body shook with another sob, but she remained quiet on their way back upstairs. She eyed him closely when they entered the lift, no doubt wondering where they were going, but the surprise was evident on her face when the doors pinged open to reveal the bedroom corridor. Walking in the opposite direction, Brax stopped in his tracks when the two of them came into view, a thick folder under his arm. Stone? He grumbled uncertainly, his head tilting. Tell Linda to send breakfast up to my bedroom. A proper one. He left with a curt nod, side-eyeing Kate as he went. Sighing, Warren entered his bedroom with Kate sniffling in his arms, heading straight into the ensuite he rarely used. He set her onto the marble counter in the bathroom, turning on the shower and hanging a fluffy midnight blue towel on the hook next to it. His old instincts nagged at him when he faced a despondent Kate, tears still falling freely down her cheeks, her legs dangling off the counter. The instinct to take her into his arms and protect her from the world returned then, as strong as it had ever been. Warren ground his teeth. Except her problems could no longer be solved with a trip to the park or a visit to the ice cream van. You didn't know. Warren wiped her tears away as he'd once done so often. Nostalgia pumped through his veins when he thought of all the times he'd dried her tears in the week he taught her how to ride a bike. She flinched back from him, staring at the floor. It wasn't a question, but Kate shook her head anyway. I didn't know. Shower, he told her, picking at the shoulder of the ragged shirt she wore. I'll get you a fresh pair of clothes. There's spare toiletries in here. He opened the cupboard under the sink and pulled out a wicker basket brimming with products. Take what you need, all right? You'll feel better after a shower and some food. The slight movement of her head might have been a nod. He was closing the bathroom door when her small voice called to him. Warren? Are you going to kill my father? He answered truthfully. Eventually. Kate stared in front of her, unseeing. Okay. Reese Stone leant on the doorway to Warren's office, his dark hair artfully falling over his brow. I'm assuming your original plan of keeping Charlton locked in the cellar for the rest of his life and throwing Kate in prison for the rest of hers has gone out the window somewhat. Somewhat. Warren leaned back in his chair. He'd let Kate go back to sleep after her breakfast, curled up under the covers, her chestnut hair streaming across the pillow. It had been more difficult than he'd expected to drag his body away from hers. Reese lifted his chin. Has she pleaded for mercy for her father? Not at all. Ah, a woman after my own heart. Reese wiggled an eyebrow suggestively, approaching the computer monitor to get a closer look. Now I know she's not running a human trafficking ring, I wouldn't mind trying my luck. Warren pinned him against the wall in an instant. Don't you fucking dare, he snarled. A sly smile crept onto Reese's face. A joke, my friend? He raised his hands, displaying the jagged scar across his palm, one that he'd received back when the two of them were cellmates in prison. Fuck you and fuck your jokes. Warren collapsed back into the office chair, swiveling around to face the computer monitor in front of him. It felt like an invasion of her privacy to watch her on the security camera, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. Stone? Stone? Both Warren and Reese turned to see Brax enter the room, taking up far too much of the doorway. Brax cleared his throat. I didn't realize you were busy. Shall I come back later? No need to leave. I'm not here for company business. Reese waved a hand, his expression hardening. Warren nodded, an eye on the monitor. Have you heard from your contact at the police? I've just got off the phone with him. Nothing we haven't heard before. Graves was a decorated officer whose specialty was in undercover operations, Brax announced. According to his records, he received the Queen's Commendation for bravery just before you were imprisoned. The following week, he resigned from his post. Prick. And his current whereabouts? Warren prompted. No one has seen him since. Warren's mind drifted to the night of the crash. To begin with, he hadn't realized what was happening when Graves arrived on the scene, the blue lights of his police car flashing. He'd just been relieved to see a police officer, reassured that the emergency services were beginning to arrive. He'd weaved in and out of consciousness. At that point, he hadn't even realized that Aaron was dead, flung through the windscreen in a spray of glass and blood. Warren had seen the distant figure lying in the road, but in his confusion had assumed they'd hit a deer. Let me know if anything changes, Warren said, his mind a decade away. Brax took his leave with a short, "Will do." Eventually Reese spoke up, his arms crossed over his chest. What's your plan for Graves? I intend to take from him what they took from me. A simple answer for a simple question. Do you not think your plan is a tad gruesome? Warren countered his friend with a derisive laugh. Did they not earn it? They took years from me, Reese. What should have been some of the best years of my life. Instead, I spent it rotting in a prison cell. I'm not surprised you don't understand. You actually committed the crime you were imprisoned for, as did Jensen. He raised his hands as Reese opened his mouth. I do not blame you. Fuck, if I'd have been there, I'd have helped you do it. But neither of you understand what it feels like to see your life slipping away before your very eyes, knowing there's nothing you can do about it. Reese gave him a long, unwavering look. Given the friends you made in prison, I'd say it hasn't turned out too badly. No. This time his laugh was genuine. No, it hasn't. The four of them, Warren, Reese, Jensen, and Aldous, had all been dealt shitty hands by life one way or another. If someone had said to me on the day I entered prison that a decade later the four of us would own a company worth billions, I'd have laughed in their face. True. Reese's smirk was crooked. I was nothing but a mouthy little prick from a council estate, and yet... He spread his hands. Here we are. Was a mouthy little prick? Don't give me that shit. Reese aimed a kick at Warren's good leg. I'm a reformed man compared to what I used to be. Warren threw a pen in Reese's direction, snorting when it hit him right between the eyes. What not living in poverty does to a man. Reese was picking up the pen to launch it back in his direction when his face fell, his eyes focused on a point over Warren's shoulder. Are those tablets? Warren swiveled round on the office chair, sucking in a panicked breath. Kate sat on one of the armchairs in his bedroom. Small boxes were strewn across the floor next to her. He recognized the packaging as the painkillers he'd received after his last surgery. The boxes weren't what had him panicking, however. What had his heart stopping was the pile of tablets on the table in front of her. He leapt to his feet, stumbling as he raced from his office, skidding around the corner slightly too quickly and smashing into a framed photograph on the opposite wall. Glass shattered behind him, but Warren didn't stop. Reese wasn't far behind him as he leapt up the stairs, taking them two at a time, in his desperation to reach his kitten. The look of despondency on her face this morning had cut him deeply, knowing it had been inflicted by him. Knowing he'd shown her those fucking photographs. He'd taken her into the room in which he'd beaten her father black and blue. Warren shouldered into his bedroom, barely bothering to use the handle. Kate jumped a foot in the air as he burst through the door, the glass of water in her hand slopping over her lap. Skidding to his knees before her, Warren shoved the table away. The tablets scattered across the floor. How many have you taken? He croaked, taking her face in his trembling hands. She looked away with red-rimmed eyes. Go away. Her voice cracked. How many? He shouted, hearing Reese moving behind him. Tell me! It's all right, Reese whispered softly, a balm to Warren's bite. We're not angry at you. We just need to know how many you've taken. Kate shook her head as much as she was able to within his grasp. I haven't. Tears ran down her cheeks, tracking salty paths underneath her chin. The relief was so heady that Warren felt lightheaded. He pulled her into his lap, holding her with a vice-like grip as she wept into his suit. Blood pounded through him, furious and relentless. I have you, kitten, he chanted into her hair. Everything will be okay. I have you. But it won't be. She pushed away from him. I enabled my father for years. I took out credit card after credit card to keep his stupid fucking club open. I saved every penny I could to help him, to allow him to invest in his business. I sacrificed a decade of my life to help him, and he was using it all to... She choked in a breath, unable to finish. I facilitated the abuse that went on in his club. I've wasted my life, Warren. I thought I was helping him through his grief. Instead, I allowed him to... He attempted to soothe her as she hyperventilated. You didn't know. Ignorance is not an excuse. Her cheeks were shiny with tears. Even before this morning, there was no point to my life, Warren. The debt was burying me. My father has never cared about me. Aaron was always his favorite. Even when Talbot was touching me, Dad was more concerned about them damaging Aaron's stupid fucking photograph than he was about me. Warren didn't say anything, letting her get everything out. He simply stroked her hair, letting her know he was listening. I have no one. There isn't a single person that gives a shit about me. The only people that contact me are from fucking debt companies about missed payments and defaults. The only people that ever visit the house are bailiffs or Dad's dealer. And Dad digs me deeper with every move he makes. I don't see the point of it anymore, Warren. The best apology I can give those women, those girls, is to kill herself, Warren realized. Just let me go, she begged tearfully. Let me have some peace. Reese's expression was tortured as he looked on, as white as Warren had ever seen him. Had it been anyone other than Kate in his arms, he would have checked to see if his friend was all right, given Reese's history with suicide. But all Warren could spare him was a grim look, devoting his attention to the weeping woman in his arms, murmuring platitudes into her hair, and making affectionate passes over her skin. This was his fault. He'd treated her as a suspect from the get-go. He'd given Talbot and Braxton free rein in collecting Paul and his anonymous bookkeeper. Even when he'd discovered the bookkeeper was Kate, he hadn't stopped for a minute to wonder at her guilt, to wonder if she might be innocent, to wonder if it might be the straw that broke the kitten's back. Chapter 3. Kate. It had taken Kate an age to remove all the tablets from their blister packaging, cracking each one open only to carefully arrange it in a mandala-like formation. She'd fiddled with her little piece of art, shuffling it around like a picky child playing with their food, only to come to the conclusion that she didn't want to kill herself. She just didn't want to continue living. No, that wasn't true. What she wanted was to never have existed at all. Perhaps her own personal fairy godmother could come and take her life and give it to someone who needed it. An equitable compromise. Kate would cease to exist and someone else would get to live. I need to take a Zoom call, Warren said, looking up over his laptop screen. He sat at the desk in his bedroom as she rested on the armchair in the corner, gazing listlessly out of the window. Kate nodded, uncaring. He'd barely left the room since finding her little art project laid out across the coffee table, working at the desk in the corner, and sleeping on the sofa. From what she'd been able to ascertain, Warren owned a company, or part of it anyway. She recognized one of the voices on the call as the man who'd flushed her ex-mandala down the toilet. Reese. The kind, regal-looking man with high cheekbones and striking amber eyes. The other two were strangers, distinguishable only by their accents. One Scottish, the other from the home counties, just like her and Warren. The figures they discussed were insane, throwing around so many millions that she was sick of hearing the word. Sick with jealousy. Sick with hate. Had she sunk so low that she apparently hated anyone doing better than her? Yes. Yes, she had. Exhaustion swamped her thoughts. Kate closed her eyes, curling up against the stupidly expensive armchair and letting out a long sigh. The photographs of those poor women flashed through her mind like awful, horrifying fireworks. She grimaced, trying to shake away the thought. She flinched as Warren's broad hand encased her shoulder, coming out of her reverie. "Are you all right?" he asked. On the desk, his laptop was closed, his business meeting clearly over. "Fine," she said dully. Warren checked his watch. A heavy, expensive watch with a black leather band and an emerald green face to match his eyes. "Come outside with me. I want to show you something." Kate felt like a specter walking through Warren's house. With the exception of her trip down to the cellars the morning after her arrival, she hadn't bothered to leave the bedroom. Warren led her down the pale golden corridor, taking her down a set of curved marble stairs that ran alongside a row of arched windows looking out over the garden. If it could be called a garden. It resembled a golf course with islands of mature trees and a striped lawn that some poor gardener must have spent hours creating. Come to think of it, he probably wasn't that poor if he had this much work. It was the kind of house that she'd only ever seen when scrolling through houses for sale online. The ones that were so far out of her budget it was laughable. It would only ever depress her, but she did it anyway. A moment's reprieve from her misery. When Warren opened the front door, Kate died a little inside when she saw columns proudly adorning the front porch. Because, of course they did. Her brow furrowed when she looked past the columns. A pink and white ice cream van was parked in Warren's driveway, complete with childlike illustrations and photographs of the different ice creams available. "Why is there a Mr. Whippy van here?" Warren's grin was a thing of beauty, a crooked reminder of the adoring crush she'd had on him as a 12-year-old girl. The middle-aged ice cream man leant his elbow on the window. "What'll it be?" "A double 99 for me." Warren turned to Kate expectantly. "With 2 flakes." "A 99 for me, please. Just a single one," she said, a sense of shyness coming over her. "With a flake?" the ice cream man asked. Kate nodded, remaining silent as Warren's hand slipped into hers. "Just like old times?" he murmured. "When you used to pick me up from school," she played along, pretending that his touch wasn't jump-starting her heart. Warren would wait for her at her school's back gate. Come rain or shine, he would be there. Erin would usually be bunking off somewhere up to no good, but she could always count on Warren. And in summer we'd stop at the ice cream van on our walk back home. Warren took their ice creams, passing hers over. Their fingers touched again for a moment, and she couldn't help her breath quickening, thinking of how he'd touched her on the first night. The feelings he'd elicited when he pressed her up against the wall, his erection grinding into her stomach. That, Warren, had seemingly disappeared after he'd realized she hadn't been involved in her father's activities. Instead, she'd fallen back into the platonic best friend's younger sister territory. They followed the stone path she'd seen from the window, walking past the picturesque pond full of orange and white koi. The fish clustered to the side of the pond when they approached, their mouths bobbing open in the search for food. "Have they been fed?" she asked Warren, walking past the tall hedge circling the pond. "They look ravenous." "They're lying bastards," he assured her, making quick work of his enormous ice cream. "Don't trust a word they say." Warren walked through an archway built into the hedge, leading into deeper woodland, down a winding path where the scent of earthy moss pervaded, and pine needles littered the soft ground. After a few minutes of silent walking, a large tree came into view, and Kate realized why Warren had brought her here. A swing hung from one of its branches, swaying gently in the summer breeze. Warren took hold of the frayed ropes attached to the thick block of wood, acting as a seat, darkened splotches scattered across his knuckles. One push, for old time's sake. Too spiritless to argue with him, Kate sat. "Cone?" she offered him, holding it up. "Do you still not eat them?" Kate mumbled vaguely about sugar-scented cardboard. It was a hill she would die on. His eyes creased, but he took it without a word, consuming it in 3 quick bites. You're a Philistine, he chided her, placing his first push on the small of her back. The ropes were harsh against her palm, but Kate held on as she began to swing. The tips of her faded trainers disturbed the fine layer of soil beneath the swing, but all she could focus on was the intermittent pressure of Warren's hands on her back. Didn't you say 1 push? She chided him softly. 1 push for old time's sake, he agreed. I didn't say what the rest would be for. She almost had the energy required to roll her eyes. A businessman through and through. I'm surprised you didn't go into politics with that attitude. A boy who went straight from foster care into prison for manslaughter. Yes, I'm sure I'd do well rubbing shoulders with the old Etonians who've barely had to lift a finger to wipe their own arses. She thought back to the call he'd been on earlier. Were you not discussing buying a company for £120 million only this morning? Warren's pushes stopped coming, and Kate let her feet drag her to an untidy stop. I didn't think you were listening. He came around the swing to lean against the tree's thick trunk. She shrugged. I wasn't. Not really. Kate pressed her lips together with a sigh. How did you get so much money? Luck, coupled with meeting Reese Stone and his brother Aldous in addition to their cousin Jensen. Kate finally released the question that had been rattling around her brain like a sharp stone in her shoe. What happened to those women in the photos? His emerald eyes flickered. We're looking for them. We've been questioning your father since he arrived. He was still alive then. We being you and Brax? Mostly. Warren crossed his arms over his chest, frowning down at her. So you're Warren Stone now? Had Warren Harper died entirely? Warren Harper died with Aaron, kitten. The thought was like a knife in her heart. Why? When I was in prison, I was more alone than I'd ever been before. He looked away with a frown, a tattoo creeping above his collar. I was lucky enough to have Reese as my cellmate. His mother, Allison, she did more for me than any foster family or social worker ever had. 18 months into my sentence, they offered me their name, and I took it. Kate pressed her feet to the ground, propelling the swing slightly. When did you get out of prison? 4 years ago. Her lips parted in shock. How did you go from being in prison to owning... She gestured in the direction of the house. Buckingham fucking Palace in 4 years. Reese, Jensen, and I were in prison. Aldous was on the outside managing the holding company. She blinked. That doesn't even remotely answer my question. Just as she heard distant voices, movement turned her head to the left. 2 men were walking nonchalantly up the path. One had a pair of binoculars hanging around his neck, whilst the other bore twin walking poles in his hands. Ramblers. Kate had sometimes seen them out and about in the forest that bordered their estate, walking at a brisk pace and avoiding teenagers on mountain bikes like the plague. Warren lifted his body off the tree trunk, wearing an unfriendly expression. Gentlemen, this is private property. The 2 men shared a look. Our apologies, the one wearing binoculars said, pulling a map out of his pocket. We are a bit lost, however. We've gone slightly turned around. I don't suppose you'd be able to point us in the right direction? Back the way you came, Warren said grumpily. Where are you headed? Broadwood's Tower, near Box Hill. Then you're on the wrong side of the A24. He pointed at a spot on the map. You're here, on this path. If you follow it to the North Downs Way... Kate looked up in time to see the other man drop his walking pole and pull a wicked sharp knife from his jacket. She shouted out a garbled warning, but Warren was already moving. He spun to the left, avoiding the bite of the blade, before wrenching the attacker's arm down and twisting hard. But whilst Warren was gaining the upper hand, the second moved in for the kill, drawing his own blade. She had barely seen the bright sunlight flicker off the second attacker's knife before she jumped into action. Her father may be a neglectful addict, but he had also been a keen boxer back in the day, and was still an avid follower of the sport now. Curling her hand into a fist, just like her father taught her, Kate took advantage of the attacker's focus on Warren. With all her strength, she launched herself at the second one, or more specifically, at his liver. Kate grunted as her shoddy, untrained punch connected. The impact sent a jolt up her elbow, but she ignored the pain, readying herself for another punch. But the second attacker collapsed where he stood, his knees caving in and his arms coming around his waist. He hit the forest floor with an agonized grin. A smile flashed onto her face momentarily. Had that actually worked? But there was no time to contemplate her victory. Warren, distracted by the sound of her grunt, turned. A mistake. The man he'd been fighting, his nose bloodied, took the opportunity as soon as it presented itself, aiming a lethal kick at Warren's right leg, sending an awful, terrible crack through the air. Despite his trousers covering the skin beneath, the sight of his broken calf, bent at almost a right angle, nearly had her retching. Somehow, Warren barely reacted, clearly running on nothing but adrenaline. As soon as he hit the ground, he snapped up the knife the second attacker had dropped and plunged it into the incapacitated man's throat. And then Kate made a mistake of her own. She cried out at the sight of Warren murdering the second man, realizing too late that the first attacker's attention was no longer on Warren, but on her. "Run!" Warren bellowed, attempting to get back onto his feet, his snapped calf swaying as he moved. Filled with adrenaline and terror, Kate ran with every ounce of energy she possessed. Tree branches whipped past her, occasionally snatching at her hair. Chancing a look back, Kate was propelled forward with a start of fear at the sight of the man racing behind her, getting closer with every step. Her chest heaved, a stitch carving its way into her side. A whimper left her when she broke through the tree line, faced with a gentle meadow, and nowhere to hide. Without pausing, Kate cried out as the man tackled her to the ground, forcing the air from her lungs. She gasped, trying to scream for help, but he wrenched her onto her back, wrapping his hands around her neck, pressing into her with such pressure that she was afraid he'd snap her spine. His knee compounded the pain, digging into her ribs. Her legs kicked uselessly, achieving nothing but thudding her heels into the earth. Her eyes watered, tears streaming into her hairline. Kate desperately tried to suck in air, a thin, reedy sound escaping from her throat. Fading. Everything was fading, from the pain to her fear. The nothingness grew, lulling her towards the darkness that would never end. Hadn't she wanted this? Just as her eyes began to dim, the man's body shuddered, his eyes widening, his pupils dilating. Blood began to drip from his open mouth, slowly at first, but then the flow gathered speed until a continuous stream landed on her chest. Was he drooling blood? Inside his mouth, something sparkled silver in the sunlight, something beautiful. The crushing grip around her throat loosened in minute increments. Kate pulled a deep, painful breath into her lungs, and then another. With every inhale, her surroundings began to return. Sunlight. The meadow, the trees, the pain around her neck. Warren, standing behind the attacker with a grim, satisfied smile. The attacker's lips sagged open. The flow of blood had turned into a river, and on top of his tongue sat the tip of the blade that Warren had plunged through the back of his head. "If you had given both the Charltons and the evidence to the police, this would have never happened," Aldous bellowed, shooting Kate a furious glance. She shrunk into the sofa, not having the energy to fight back. Not today. Every word was a painful rasp, so she settled for a glare in his direction. The same police with a history of accepting bribes from Paul Charlton? Warren went to stand in front of her, resting his hand on her shoulder as it butted up against his leg. A barrier from Aldous. She resisted the temptation to lean into his side, her brain whirring back into action. Where had her father gotten the money to bribe the police from? Aldous laughed at that. "Yes, it's what Charlton deserves." He glared down at Kate as though expecting her to defend her father. "And what I deserve is to have Paul Charlton and William Graves locked in my cellar," Warren rasped furiously, screaming for fucking mercy. "Sadistic prick." Aldous shook his head with a grimace. Kate's head turned when Braxton entered the room, as formidable as ever, having been given the task of moving her father and the two corpses to some nameless location. It had been the second thing Warren had shouted on carrying her back into the house, the first being to get her medical attention. She had been looked over, poked, and prodded by a doctor. A private one, she assumed, given that he'd been summoned to the house with nothing but a phone call and made no suggestion of calling the police. Broken blood vessels hid underneath her eyelids, whilst her neck was a network of bruises and scratches, the latter being self-inflicted in her desperate attempt to get the attacker off of her. Not that Kate remembered that bit. "Can you blame me?" Warren retorted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Aldous' nostrils flared as he delved his hand into his hair. "I blame you for being a prick. The rest is excusable." Leaning against the door jamb, Reese snorted at his younger brother. "Are we ready? I want to get going before rush hour." Warren nodded, lending Kate an encouraging smile. "We're going to stay with Reese for a bit." He touched her shoulder kindly. "For safety reasons." Kate noted, perplexed by the fact that Warren was walking. Had she simply imagined his snapped leg? She had been deprived of oxygen, after all. Reese pursed his lips to the side. "And I won't dress you up like a roadman." Jensen's dark eyebrow quirked up. "A what?" Reese shared a private smirk with Kate, helping her to her feet. "Jensen's exceedingly old," Reese muttered into her ear, slinking an arm around her shoulders in a surprisingly brotherly embrace. He steered her towards the front door, gently supporting her across the smooth tiles. A third pair of footsteps shadowed them, familiar ones. "You'll have to excuse him." "I heard that, you prick." Jensen's Scottish accent rang out after them. "I'm not surprised. Did you know ears tend to get bigger as you age?" Soon Kate and Warren were being shepherded across the countryside in Reese's sleek Grand Tourer, a Range Rover full of security guards shadowing their every move. Warren sat next to her, as still as stone. A ticking muscle in his jaw was his only sign of life. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Kate rasped, when the silence grew too great, wincing. "Is what a good idea?" Warren murmured, finally looking at her. She caught Reese's eye in the rearview mirror. "Taking the targets of an assassination attempt to your home?" "I don't have a house in the middle of nowhere, Kate. It's far safer." "I live in a penthouse overlooking Regent's Park," Reese explained, his face illuminated by the mood lighting around the dashboard. "There's security on the ground floor with private lifts to each of the flats. I have my own private security working in the building, as do several of the other residents. Warren's guards will be joining them. You'll be safe there, Kate. I promise. And better dressed." "May I ask why you seem to have women's clothing on hand at the drop of a hat?" Warren pondered. "I sent my assistant to Peter Jones to find some clothing for Kate. Hadn't had a chance to send it down yet." Reese turned round momentarily. Fair warning, she bought more lingerie than expected. Her face flamed red, but she managed to mutter a meek, "Thank you." The impressive beige facade of Reese's apartment building came into view just as the last of the day's light fell below the horizon. Kate squinted at the bright lights as she was ushered straight towards the correct lift, feeling overly conspicuous in Warren's overlarge clothing, complete with extensive bruising around her neck. "Kitchen?" Reese announced when they entered his vast, airy flat, the white walls stark against the blooming plant life. "Dining room, living room, bathroom, cinema room. The bedrooms are upstairs. Do you want dinner?" Kate stared at the dining table. That thing alone was bigger than her bedroom. An enormous mahogany monstrosity. Order a curry." Warren bit out a curt command, dragging her along with him as he walked. "We're going upstairs." Thank you, Reese," she whispered, her throat scraping against itself. "Clothes are on the bed in the spare room," he smiled, tapping away at his phone. Warren led her straight to the bedroom she'd be staying in, clearly knowing his way around Reese's lavish apartment. "Warren, what's the—" He slammed the door shut behind her and threw the lock. Suddenly, Kate found herself entombed in Warren's grasp, his body pressed against hers. Placing his nose under her ear, he groaned, letting out a deep exhale that sent sparks traveling down her spine. He leaned back, catching her gaze in an iron grip. "You nearly died today." Warren closed his eyes with a shudder, as if the thought was too painful to bear. "I nearly lost you again, kitten." His hand played around her jawline, sinking down to the painful bruising that bloomed on her throat. His nostrils flared in anger, but she lay her hands against his chest, ignoring his jolt. Going up on tiptoes, Kate brought her hands up to massage the back of his head, reveling in the soft touch of his dark hair, gently scraping her nails against his scalp. Warren's lip curled in a blissful, nostalgic smile. "You remember." Her grin joined his. She gave him a silent nod, recalling the endless head massages he'd given to her after a stressful day at school. Despite his protests, Kate would always reciprocate, meaning the both of them would come away looking like they'd been in a fight with an electricity pylon. Chest heaving, he stared at her with heavy-lidded eyes. "You're not a child anymore." Kate shook her head, pulling him closer. Her body egged her on all the way, dazzled by his firm figure against hers. She pressed her hips into his, wanting more. "My kitten," he whispered. Warren's gaze flicked down to her lips, but he yanked himself away with a small shake, going over to the enormous bag on the bed and shuffling through the clothing within. "Come on, let me get you settled." The first tinges of something rolled through her. Was it hope? Perhaps that first night wasn't such a one-off after all. So those are the first 3 chapters of Heart of Stone, and as you can see, we covered a lot of ground in that. Like, literally the first 3 chapters are 51 pages of the book, and it covers her father being a piece of shit. Let's be real. Like, her father's fucking terrible. And her finding Warren, the man who is ostensibly responsible for her brother's death. And all of this taking place in sort of a romantic suspense backdrop. I'll be honest, I didn't actually know what to expect going into Heart of Stone. I try to be really chill about going into a book such that I know less about it than I would otherwise know if I read through the summary or something to that effect. So all I really knew about Heart of Stone was that it was written by Stevie Sparks, who had written a novella that I was absolutely obsessed with, and that it had that sort of brother's best friend vibe. That's all I knew. I had no idea of the romantic suspense element of it, and I was so excited to get that so early in the story and find out that there's like a real layer of suspense and thriller, and that drives a lot of the story. Like, yes, you do have the chemistry between Warren and Kate, which is top-notch, absolutely beautiful. But you also have this underlying story of the Charlton's Gentlemen's Club, tried saying that 4 times fast, and the human trafficking that it supported, and Kate's role, or lack thereof, in everything that was going on at that club. And Warren trying to come to terms with who Kate is now and what she has been forced to live through at the hands of her father and others. Because there's some real nitty-gritty that you'll find out later in the story. In addition to meeting Warren and Kate and their, amazing, hot as fuck chemistry, we also get to meet the other 4. They're not all Stone brothers, but they are all part of that Stone company, which are Jensen, Reese, and Aldous. Jensen's book is the second in the Dark Billionaire series, and it's a stone's throw, and trust me when I tell you, y'all, if you think you love Warren just based on these first 3 chapters, y'all ain't fucking ready for Jensen. He destroyed me. We are actually getting the 3rd book in the Dark Billionaires series, which, as I understand it, is Aldous's book. Yay! Very, very soon. I am extremely excited to see this one because, as I understand it, book 3 is very much a story of love wherever you find it. And I'm so thrilled to get that. But throughout this story, you constantly see Warren's battle with his own demons. Those come in the form of Charlton, who's a piece of shit. I cannot say that enough. Charlton is garbage. And his own abandonment as a child. And so anytime that something comes up, he finds it really hard to believe anything more than the absolute worst of people. And it's heartbreaking because this man so desperately wants to see the good, but he's been surrounded by the terrible and the atrocities of the world for way too long, including his own time in prison as an innocent man. And it's heartbreaking because he sets himself back with Kate just by virtue of how he responds to certain things because of his own trauma. And they get past it. But there is definitely angst going into it that does result in a fair amount of problems between them. But they communicate through it. It's actually kind of cool because it's that side of the third act angsty breakup that we never really see. Something happens and he accuses her in the shittiest way possible because he's a man. It's fine. And then she corrects him and he gets fact checked by a couple of others. And then he's back to, I definitely did not mean this. I love you. You are my everything. Please forgive me, kitten. And by the way, if that pet name does not make you want to just melt into a puddle, I don't know what you're on. Because that is the sexiest pet name in the world. Well, one of them. I've got a few preferences. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad to be back in the reading cave here at the Moonlit Library, reading y'all smutty story time. If you, like me, loved Heart of Stone, and those first 3 chapters just reached inside your chest and grabbed your heart, you can find it available through Amazon and Kindle Unlimited as well. And you can also find the other books in the Dark Billionaires series, which is a stone's throw, with book 3 coming hopefully very, very soon. And then there's also Silver Foxed, which is Stevie's novella, and actually her first book to really sort of be set in the US versus over in England. I apologize again for refusing to put on an accent, Brit, Scottish, or other beside. I figured that might take away from the general enjoyment of the story to just hear whatever atrocities I would commit upon the accent community. So I hope you loved Heart of Stone as much as I did, and I hope you'll go read the rest of it. It's a phenomenal book. Can't wait to see you guys back at the Moonlit Library next week, and looking forward to introducing you to next week's author, who is literally one of my outright faves. I love her so much. Thanks, guys.